Story 1. The air in the small Queensland town of Gin Gin was thick with the promise of a perfect May morning in 2025. For 17-year-old Phoebe Bishop, it felt like the world was finally aligning. Standing at an impressive 180 centimeters, with a cascade of long, dyed red hair and striking hazel eyes, she was a young woman who had always followed her own beat. Today, that beat was a thrum of pure excitement. She was packed and ready, her luggage waiting by the door. After a short flight from the nearby city of Bundaberg to Brisbane, she would catch another plane that would carry her across the vast Australian continent to Western Australia and into the arms of her boyfriend, Levi. They had been planning this trip for weeks. Camping under the immense, star-dusted sky of the West was the goal, a romantic adventure for two young people in love. Levi had already bought her a gift, something special to mark the occasion. Their video calls were filled with laughter and playful arguments about who talked more in their sleep. Phoebe's heart fluttered at the thought of seeing him. Her life had not been without its complexities, but this trip felt like a new beginning, a sun-drenched chapter waiting to be written. The house she lived in was a rural property, shared with two housemates, 34-year-old James Wood and his partner, 33-year-old Tanika Bromley. The arrangement was a practical one. Tanika had once worked for Phoebe's mother, Kylie Johnson, before being made redundant the previous year, and the connection had led to Phoebe moving in. To the outside world, it was just a roof over their heads, but within the walls of the Gin Gin house, an unspoken tension sometimes coiled in the air, a quiet undercurrent that was easy to ignore when the future felt so bright. On the morning of May 15th, 2025, Wood and Bromley were to drive her to the Bundaberg airport. Dressed in a simple green tank top and gray sweatpants, Phoebe was a picture of casual anticipation. As she climbed into their gray Hyundai 935, the familiar landscape of rural Queensland rolled by. Stretches of farmland, stands of eucalyptus, the wide, unassuming sky. The drive was just over 50 kilometers, a short journey to the threshold of her adventure. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the Hyundai was captured on CCTV, a fleeting image of a car cruising down Airport Drive in Bundaberg. This was the last time Phoebe Bishop was ever seen alive. She never entered the airport terminal. She never checked in for her flight. The seat next to Levi on the plane to Perth remained empty. The camping trip would never happen. As the day wore on, her phone fell silent, and her bank account lay dormant. Phoebe Bishop, a young woman on the cusp of a joyful reunion, had vanished into thin air. The first tremor of fear began far away, in Western Australia. Levi waited, his excitement slowly curdling into confusion, then anxiety. He called her phone again and again, but the calls went straight to voicemail. This wasn't like Phoebe. They were in constant contact. He called her family. Back in Queensland, her mother, Kylie, and older sister, Kaylee, felt the same sickening lurch of worry. Phoebe was strong-willed, yes, but she was also deeply connected to her family. For her to drop off the grid like this was unthinkable. By the next day, May 16th, the family's rising panic had solidified into a formal report. The Queensland Police Service issued a missing person alert, plastering Phoebe's face and description across news channels and social media. The public plea went out, a tall, pale-skinned girl with long red hair, last seen near the airport. Have you seen her? Do you have dashcam footage? Her mother took to Facebook, her words a raw cry into the digital void, begging for anyone who had seen or heard from her daughter to come forward. The community responded, sharing the post, hoping for a simple explanation, a teenage whim. But in their hearts, her family knew this was something else. This was wrong. The police investigation began with the frustratingly simple facts. A girl was supposed to catch a flight, and she didn't. Detectives from the Bundaberg Criminal Investigation Branch started at the airport, the last known destination. They scoured hours of surveillance footage from the terminal. The result was chilling. There was no sign of Phoebe, not at the check-in counters, not at security, not at the gate. The gray Hyundai had driven past the airport, but Phoebe had never gotten out. The story her housemates had told, that they had dropped her off, was beginning to fray at the edges. The focus of the investigation sharpened, turning inward, toward the two people who were the last to see her, James Wood and Tanika Bromley. The property in Gin Gin was declared a crime scene, as was the Hyundai 935. Forensic teams descended, searching for any trace, any microscopic clue that could explain what had happened between that house and the airport. The housemates were questioned. Their answers and their actions only deepened the suspicion. As the days stretched into a week, the public search for Phoebe intensified, but the police investigation was already moving down a much darker path. They no longer believed they were searching for a runaway. Privately, they feared they were hunting for a body. On May 23rd, a critical breakthrough came from the silent signals of Phoebe's phone. Data pinged from her device led investigators to a vast, rugged expanse of wilderness southwest of Bundaberg, the Goodnight Scrub National Park. The park was a labyrinth of dense bushland, winding tracks, and waterways, a place where secrets could easily be swallowed by the earth. Specialist police, including the dive squad, were deployed, beginning a painstaking search of the unforgiving terrain. They found some items, things they believed were linked to the case, which were whisked away for forensic examination. But the feeling among the investigators was one of rising frustration. They had a strong suspicion that crucial evidence, perhaps Phoebe's body itself, had been moved before they even arrived. The killer, they believed, was one step ahead. While the police searched, Phoebe's family lived in a state of suspended agony. Every ringing phone, every news report was a potential source of either relief or unbearable pain. On May 31st, Kylie Johnson shared a video online, her face a portrait of a mother's anguish. Her hope for Phoebe's safe return was a flickering candle against a storm of fear. "I just want to know where my daughter is," she pleaded. The search efforts grew more desperate. Cadaver dogs, with their uncanny ability to detect human remains, were brought into the national park, their handlers guiding them through the thick, unrelenting scrub. In Brisbane, Queensland Premier called Phoebe's disappearance deeply concerning, a sentiment that echoed across the state. Then, on June 4th, the official search was abruptly suspended. The announcement was a blow to public morale, but behind the scenes, the case was reaching a critical turning point. That same day, police arrested James Wood. The net was closing. The following day, June 5th, the dam of silence broke. Police formally arrested both Wood and Bromley. The charges were the family's worst nightmare realized: 1 count of murder and 2 counts of interfering with a corpse. The second charge was particularly sinister, confirming the police theory that Phoebe's body had been moved, not once, but twice. Investigators alleged she was killed on May 15th, the day she disappeared, shortly after the car was seen near the airport. Her body was then moved, hidden. 2 days later, it was moved again, a gruesome and calculated effort to conceal the crime. The motive remained shrouded in mystery, but a darker picture of Phoebe's life with her housemates began to emerge. A report surfaced that several witnesses had seen Phoebe in a local store just days before she vanished. She had appeared weak and hungry, her state alarming enough for strangers to take notice. Had she been held against her will, abused by the very people she lived with? The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken horror. And then there was the car. Police had evidence that after the CCTV sighting near the airport, the suspect's Hyundai had been crudely disguised. A paper logo was stuck over the real one, and the license plate was altered with electrical tape. The clumsy, desperate acts of people trying to make their vehicle disappear. The day after the arrests, on June 6th, Wood and Bromley's case was mentioned in the Bundaberg Magistrates Court. Bromley appeared via video link from the watch house. Wood was not required to appear. In the courtroom gallery sat Phoebe's heartbroken family, her mother Kylie and sister Kaylee, forced to come face to face with one of the people accused of her murder. The prosecution told the court they needed more time to prepare their brief of evidence, and the case was adjourned. Both suspects were remanded in custody. Outside the courthouse, Kaylee Bishop, her voice choked with emotion, made a final, heartbreaking plea. "If you've got any information about Phoebe, just come forward," she begged. 3 weeks is too long for us as a family. We just want her home. She was loved, she's missed dearly. That very afternoon, their desperate wish for answers was granted in the most devastating way possible. Acting on new information, a lone detective returned to the vast wilderness near Goodnight Scrub National Park with a cadaver dog. They ventured off an unassuming path, deep into a thick, isolated patch of unrelentingly dense bushland. At 2:30 p.m., the dog hit on something. There, in the quiet of the Australian bush, police found human remains. They did not appear to have been buried, simply left on a back road, abandoned to the elements. The news ripped through the family like a physical blow. On Facebook, Kylie Johnson wrote of a pain she didn't think was possible. "I didn't think my heart could break any more than it did when you went missing, or when the charges were laid, but this is ripping me apart." On June 17th, forensic testing confirmed the inevitable. The remains belonged to Phoebe Bishop. The search was over. Her luggage and phone, however, were still missing, pieces of a puzzle that might never be fully assembled. The investigation continued to expand. A third person, 30-year-old Kieran Middlehuser, was charged in connection with the murder. He wasn't accused of the killing itself, but of trying to derail the investigation by using Phoebe's phone after her death. A cruel act of deception designed to create a false trail. As the case moved slowly through the courts, a community and a family were left to grapple with the senselessness of it all. They held vigils, lighting candles against the darkness that had stolen one of their own. They remembered Phoebe not as a victim in a tragic headline, but as the vibrant, strong-willed girl who loved her family, who was excited for her future, and who was on her way to meet the boy she loved. The legal proceedings would in time deliver a verdict, but it would never answer the most fundamental question: why? The reason a young life, so full of promise, was extinguished in a quiet corner of rural Queensland remains a secret held by her accused killers, a final, silent injustice in the heartbreaking case of Phoebe Bishop. Story 2. The life of a sideline reporter is a life lived in motion. It's a blur of airports, rental cars, and a different hotel room in a different city each week. For Erin Andrews, by 2008, this was the rhythm of her existence. As one of ESPN's most prominent and respected on-air talents, she was a constant presence on the biggest stages of college football. Her face was beamed into millions of homes every Saturday, her voice a familiar guide through the passion and pageantry of the game. She was talented, driven, and living a life many would envy, a life lived in the public eye. That public eye, however, comes with a hidden cost. The hotel room, for most travelers, is a sanctuary, a private space to shed the armor of the day, to be vulnerable, to be alone. For Andrews, it was simply a necessity, a temporary home base before moving on to the next game, the next city. She had a routine born of years on the road: check in, unpack, prepare for the broadcast, sleep, and repeat. It was a life built on a foundation of trust. Trust in the airlines to get her there safely, trust in the production crew to do their jobs, and an implicit, unstated trust in the hotels to provide a secure and private space. It was a trust she never thought to question, until the day that foundation was dynamited, leaving a crater in her life that would never fully be filled. The man who would destroy that trust was not a shadowy figure from a spy novel or a deranged fan from the bleachers. He was utterly, terrifyingly ordinary. Michael David Barrett was a Chicago area insurance executive, a man in his late 40s who spent his days in the sterile world of risk assessment and financial planning. He was, by all outward appearances, a normal, successful professional. But beneath the surface of this mundane life, a dark and meticulous obsession was taking root. In the digital world, fame is a commodity and popularity is a metric. Barrett, a creature of this world, noticed that Erin Andrews was trending on media. For him, this was not a mark of her professional success. It was a signal, a designation of value. In his twisted calculus, her popularity made her a target. He began to track her, not with the passion of a sports fan, but with the cold, methodical precision of a predator. He scoured the internet, piecing together her broadcast schedule, learning her travel patterns, and figuring out which hotels she was likely to stay in when she was on the road for Sport Channel. His plan was as simple as it was monstrous. He would follow her from city to city, book a room next to hers, and violate her privacy in the most profound way imaginable. He was not seeking an autograph or a conversation. He was seeking to capture her at her most vulnerable, to steal a piece of her life that was not meant for public consumption and to profit from it. He was a stalker, but one who operated with the dispassionate logic of a businessman undertaking a pretty ill-conceived plan to make money. In September 2008, Andrews was in Nashville, Tennessee, to cover a football game at Vanderbilt University. As she settled into her room at the Nashville Marriott at Vanderbilt University, she had no idea that she was not alone. Michael David Barrett had followed her there. His methods were a chilling study in manipulation and the exploitation of systemic weaknesses. He didn't need to break down a door or pick a lock. He simply needed to ask the right questions. He called the hotel, pretending to be part of Andrew's group and asking for confirmation of the reservation. With that piece of information, he moved to the next phase of his plan. From an in-house employee phone in the hotel restaurant, he asked to be connected to Erin Andrews' room. As the call was being placed, the screen on the phone displayed her room number. It was a catastrophic failure of security, a violation of what one expert would later call a cardinal sin in the hotel industry, giving out a guest's private information. Armed with her room number, Barrett went to her floor. He saw a housekeeping cart outside the room adjacent to hers and knew it was being cleaned. He went to the front desk and made a specific request. He wanted that room. The hotel staff, in another staggering lapse of judgment, complied. They placed a complete stranger, a man with no connection to their celebrity guest, in the room right next to hers, honoring his request without a second thought. They had, unwittingly, become his accomplices. They had unlocked the door for the wolf and led him to the fold. Once inside his room, Barrett said about his grim work. He had come prepared. Using a hacksaw, he carefully and quietly altered the peephole on Erin Andrews' hotel room door. He removed the viewer, creating a clean, unobstructed lens through which he could film. He waited. He listened for the sound of the shower, the signal that she was home and in the midst of her private routine. When he heard the water shut off, he moved. He crept out of his room into the alcove of the main hallway, a space that should have been a secure corridor but had now become his private film set. He pressed his cell phone against the modified peephole and began to record. For 4.5 minutes, he filmed Erin Andrews in her room, naked and completely unaware that she was being watched, that her most private moments were being stolen and stored on a digital device. When he was finished, he slipped back into his room, the stolen footage secure on his phone. He had what he came for. The violation was complete. He would later repeat this horrific ritual in another hotel in Milwaukee. The crime, however, did not exist in a vacuum. It was a digital time bomb, and a year later it detonated. Barrett, in his quest to monetize his crime, tried to sell the videos to the celebrity gossip website. When they refused to buy them, he uploaded them online. The bomb went off. The call came in 2009. A friend, a blogger, was on the other end of the line. His voice was grim. He told her there was a video of her, a nude video, circulating on the internet. Her first reaction was a visceral, absolute denial. "No, there's not," she insisted. "I don't do that. I'm single. I don't have that going on in my life." It was a reflexive defense, a desperate attempt to push back against a reality too horrific to comprehend. But her friend was insistent. "Erin, it's you." The confirmation of that fact was the beginning of a nightmare from which she would never fully awaken. "I even got a call from the hotel I was staying at because they wanted to know if everything was okay, because I was screaming so loud," she would later recall. Her father, hearing her screams over the phone, thought she had been in a car crash. The sound was not one of physical pain, but of a soul being ripped apart. The violation was now twofold. First, the theft of her privacy in the hotel room. Second, the public broadcast of that theft to the entire world. The video went viral. Millions of people watched it. It was forwarded in emails, linked on blogs, and discussed in chat rooms. Her body, which she had fought to keep in peak physical condition for her demanding career, was now a spectacle for anonymous gawkers. Her name, which she had worked so hard to build into a respected brand in the sports world, was now inextricably linked to a tape she never consented to making. The public reaction was a second wave of assault. A torrent of vile, victim-blaming accusations flooded the internet. She was accused of releasing the video herself as a publicity stunt. The notion was as cruel as it was absurd. "This is me naked," she later testified, her voice breaking with the memory of the humiliation. "All we kept thinking as a family, this is me. Who did this to me, and who let this happen?" The shame was suffocating. "I feel so embarrassed and I am so ashamed," she said, weeping on the witness stand years later. The terror was constant and all-encompassing. She didn't know who had filmed her. She didn't know where it had happened. She didn't know if the person was still out there, still watching her. The fear materialized in real and terrifying ways. A photographer climbed onto the balcony of her Atlanta home, sending her fleeing to her parents' house in a panic. The world, which had once felt like a place of opportunity, now felt like a landscape of threats. "She's always afraid someone's going to touch her, to get to her," her mother, Paula Andrews, testified, her own tears mirroring her daughter's. To even begin the process of finding her tormentor, she had to endure another layer of humiliation. At the urging of her lawyers and the FBI, she had to publicly confirm that it was her in the video. She and her father then had to sit with FBI agents and watch the footage, frame by sickening frame, to help them identify clues about the location. "I said, 'Dad, I'm going to puke,'" she recalled of that moment, a daughter's shame laid bare before her father's eyes. The FBI investigation methodically pieced together the puzzle. They traced the digital breadcrumbs, and all roads led to Michael David Barrett. In October 2009, he was arrested at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport as he arrived on a flight from Buffalo. The faceless phantom who had haunted her life for over a year finally had a name. He pleaded guilty to interstate stalking, admitting he had followed her over an 18-month period. For his crimes, for the indelible trauma he had inflicted, he was sentenced to just 2.5 years in federal prison. He was released in 2012. For Aaron Andrews, the criminal conviction was a hollow victory. The man who had violated her was behind bars, but the video was still out there. The damage was done. The taunts continued. "This happens every day of my life," she testified. "Either I get a tweet or somebody makes a comment in the paper, or somebody sends me a still video to my Twitter, or someone screams it at me in the stands, and I'm right back to this." The prison sentence hadn't ended her nightmare. It had merely punished one of its architects. She decided to go after the others. In 2010, she filed a civil lawsuit seeking $75 million in damages. The lawsuit named Michael David Barrett, but more importantly, it named the hotel companies Marriott International, the Nashville Marriott's owners West End Hotel Partners, and its operator Windsor Capital Group. This was not just about money. It was about accountability. It was about forcing a powerful corporation to answer for its role in enabling her violation. It was a fight to prove that the promise of safety and privacy in a hotel room is not a suggestion. It is a fundamental duty. The trial began in February 2016 in a Nashville courtroom. It was a brutal, public revisiting of her deepest trauma. The defense attorneys for the hotel argued that Barrett, the determined criminal, was solely to blame. They attempted to minimize her suffering, callously suggesting that her career hadn't been harmed by the incident, even implying it had benefited from the increased publicity. They pointed to her new endorsements and her role as a co-host on Dancing with the Stars as proof that she hadn't suffered permanent damage. It was a classic, ugly defense strategy: attack the victim. But Aaron Andrews refused to be broken. For 2 days, she sat on the witness stand and laid her soul bare. Through tears, she described the depression, the anxiety, the panic attacks. She talked about her new, paranoid hotel routine: checking into rooms under an alias, inspecting every peephole, sweeping the room for cameras, barricading her door. She described the feeling of being a victim who had been assaulted, and the constant fear that has shadowed her ever since. She lost control, her mother testified, and by golly, she's going to show the world that she can still make a living and be passionate about what she loves, and I'm proud of her. Her legal team methodically built the case for negligence. A hospitality security expert testified about the catastrophic security lapses at the Marriott, emphasizing the cardinal sin of giving out a guest's room number and honoring a stranger's request to be placed in an adjoining room. A forensic psychologist diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder, explaining how the endless online life of the video compounded her trauma, creating a wound that could never heal. Michael David Barrett did not appear at the trial in person, but his videotaped deposition was played for the jury. He attempted to take all the blame, a move Andrews' lawyers argued was a final, vindictive act to prevent her from winning any money from the hotel. He admitted to his ill-conceived plan and his chillingly detached motive for targeting her. She was popular. On March 7, 2016, after a full day of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. They awarded Erin Andrews $55 million in damages. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Andrews wept, hugging her family and her lawyers. But the most significant part of the verdict was the allocation of blame. The jury found Michael David Barrett 51% responsible. The other 49%, nearly $27 million, was assigned to the hotel's owner and operator. It was a landmark decision, a resounding declaration that a hotel's duty to protect its guests is not optional. It was a message to the entire hospitality industry that negligence has consequences. For Erin Andrews, it was a moment of profound validation. "The support I've received from the people of Nashville has been overwhelming," she said in a statement. "I've been honored by all the support from victims around the world. Their outreach has helped me be able to stand up and hold accountable those whose job it is to protect everyone's safety, security, and privacy." The case was over, but the scars remain. No amount of money can delete a viral video. No verdict can erase the memory of humiliation and fear. The case of Erin Andrews is a chilling modern parable about the dark side of fame, the terrifying power of technology in the wrong hands, and the devastating consequences of corporate negligence. It is the story of a woman whose life was shattered by the unseen eye of a stalker, but who refused to be just a victim. She fought back, not just for herself, but for every person who has ever closed a hotel room door and believed they were safe. She turned her personal nightmare into a public lesson, a legal precedent, and a powerful testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of profound violation. Story 3. The spring sun hung low over Manhattan on April 13, 2003, casting long shadows across the bustling streets of Hell's Kitchen. Maria Pilar Cruz, a 35-year-old Filipino with a sharp mind and unyielding ambition, stepped out of her high-rise apartment on West 50th Street, her petite frame moving with purpose. She was headed to an appointment that promised to address a minor but nagging concern, a black tongue condition that marred her otherwise impeccable appearance. Maria, a senior credit analyst at Barclays Capital, had built a life in New York City that was the embodiment of the American dream, a journey that began in the Philippines and carried her to the pinnacle of international finance. But that Sunday evening, as she walked toward an apartment on West 16th Street, she could not have known that her trust in a man posing as a doctor would lead to her death, her body hidden beneath a concrete slab, and a case that would expose the dangers lurking in the unregulated corners of cosmetic medicine. Maria Cruz was born in the Philippines, a small woman, just 4 feet 11 inches tall and 90 pounds, but her presence was anything but diminutive. She had arrived in the United States in 1992, driven by a fierce determination to succeed. At Fordham University, she earned an MBA in finance and international banking, graduating with honors, her intellect and work ethic setting her apart. By 2003, she was thriving at Barclays, analyzing complex financial data with a precision that earned her respect among colleagues. Her life was one of discipline, regular workouts at Crunch Gym, jogs through Central Park, and a deep Catholic faith that guided her choices. She attended St. Malachi's Church in Manhattan, where Father Erno Diaz described her as a woman of quiet strength, someone who lived her faith through kindness and ambition. She came to pursue her American dream, Father Diaz later said, his voice heavy with sorrow, and she was living it. Maria's only flaw, if it could be called that, was her attention to her appearance. The black tongue condition, likely caused by antibiotics, was a minor embarrassment, but one she was determined to fix. She had researched her options, as she did with everything, and found Dean Faiello, a man who presented himself as a skilled dermatologist. His credentials seemed legitimate. His practice, Skinovations, had operated out of prestigious addresses on Park Avenue and Gramercy Park, offering laser treatments, electrolysis, and facials. Maria, meticulous and trusting, never questioned his qualifications. She scheduled an appointment for April 13th, a Sunday evening, at an apartment on West 16th Street, where Faiello had moved his practice after legal troubles surfaced. It was a decision that would cost her everything. Dean Faiello was a man of contradictions, a charismatic figure whose charm masked a dangerous deception. Born in 1959 in Madison, New Jersey, he was voted most likely to succeed by his high school classmates in 1977. But success, for Faiello, was a mirage he chased through shortcuts and lies. He enrolled at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, but dropped out, drifting into construction before finding work at a day spa. There, he honed his skills in hair removal, a talent that gave him a foothold in New York's cosmetic industry. By 1996, he had launched Skinovations, styling himself as a dermatologist despite lacking a medical degree or license. His offices, first on Park Avenue, then at 133 East 73rd Street, and later at 117 East 18th Street, catered to a clientele eager for beauty enhancements. Faiello's good looks and easy confidence made him a fixture in Manhattan's gay club scene, but his life was unraveling under the weight of a cocaine addiction and mounting debts. In October 2002, the New York Post exposed Faiello's fraud in an article titled, "He'll Make Your Skin Crawl." The investigation revealed he was practicing medicine without a license, leading to his arrest on 3 counts of the charge. Released on $5,000 bail with the condition that he stop treating patients, Faiello ignored the order, moving his practice to the West 16th Street apartment. It was there, in a makeshift office, that Maria Cruz arrived for her laser treatment. Faiello, under the influence of cocaine and other substances, injected her tongue with lidocaine, a numbing agent, to prepare for the procedure. What happened next would change the course of countless lives. Maria's appointment began like any other, with Faiello's practiced charm putting her at ease. But as he injected the lidocaine, more than one vial, far exceeding safe limits, something went horribly wrong. Maria began to convulse, her body reacting violently to the overdose. Faiello, in a panic, called a friend, an emergency room doctor, who urged him to call 911. But Faiello, fearing exposure of his illegal practice, did nothing. Maria's convulsions gave way to labored breathing, and within minutes, she stopped breathing altogether. "She died in my arms," Faiello later told a Manhattan Supreme Court judge, his voice hollow with regret. Instead of seeking help, he made a chilling decision. He placed Maria's body in a suitcase, wrapped it in garbage bags, and drove it to his home in Newark, New Jersey, where he buried it beneath a concrete slab in his garage. For 6 weeks, her body remained hidden as Faiello continued his life, his addiction and fear driving him further into denial. On Monday, April 14th, Maria didn't show up for work at Barclays, a rare lapse for someone known for her reliability. Her colleagues grew concerned, and by Tuesday her family was frantic. Her uncle reported her missing, and detectives from the NYPD visited her West 50th Street apartment. The building superintendent let them in, revealing a pristine home with newspapers piled outside the door, a sign Maria hadn't been there. Her brother, June Cruz, told police about her black tongue condition and her appointment with Faiello, sparking suspicion. Investigators learned of Faiello's criminal history, a 1998 conviction for forging prescriptions and his recent arrest for practicing medicine without a license. When they questioned him, Faiello claimed Maria had left his apartment alive, but his story was shaky, and he fled to Costa Rica days later, missing a court date related to his earlier charges. In Manhattan, Maria's family refused to give up. Her sisters and brother distributed flyers, contacted reporters, and created a website, pleading for information. The New York Post and Newsday ran stories, but months passed with no leads. Maria's father, Rodolfo, prayed daily in Manila, his faith tested by the loss of his daughter. "Our prayers have been answered," he would later say when justice came, but added, "If only our prayers could bring Maria back." The breakthrough came in February 2004, when Greg Bach, Faiello's ex-boyfriend, contacted investigators. Bach recalled a disturbing phone call from Faiello in April 2003, where he mentioned a woman going into anaphylactic shock during a procedure. Bach also remembered Faiello's cement project in the Newark garage, accompanied by a foul odor. Suspicious, he tipped off the authorities. On February 18, 2004, cadaver dogs led detectives to the garage of Faiello's former Newark home, now occupied by new owners. Using shovels and picks, they uncovered a suitcase containing Maria's body, wrapped in plastic, preserved beneath the concrete. The discovery made headlines, the New York Post dubbing Faiello the killer quack. Father Diaz held a memorial service at St. Malachy's, where Maria's family gathered before her remains were returned to the Philippines for burial. The city mourned, and the case sparked a broader conversation about the dangers of unregulated cosmetic procedures. "This highlights lax regulations," a Vanity Fair article noted, pointing to the thousands of Americans seeking treatments from unqualified practitioners. Faiello, meanwhile, was living extravagantly in Costa Rica, spending $500 a night on a villa and posing as a doctor. Arrested poolside in Guanacaste in February 2004, he fought extradition for 15 months, exploiting a loophole by attempting to be adopted by a younger Costa Rican couple to gain citizenship. A judge rejected the ploy, noting Faiello was older than his adopters, and he was returned to New York in May 2005. Charged with second-degree murder, Faiello faced 25 years to life. His lawyer, Aaron Goldsmith, insisted he was innocent until proven guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. In October 2006, during a pre-trial hearing, Faiello accepted a plea deal, admitting to first-degree assault and practicing medicine without a license in exchange for a 20-year sentence. He told the court Maria had come for treatment of her black tongue, and he ignored medical advice to save her, fearing another arrest. "I cannot ask for her family to forgive me, for what I did was unforgivable," he said, as Maria's parents watched, their grief palpable. The autopsy failed to determine the exact cause of death, preventing a murder conviction, but the plea brought closure to a grieving family and city. Faiello was sent to Attica Correctional Facility, where he served 17 years before his release on parole in 2022. It's an example of what can happen when one person doesn't hold up their end of their life, reflecting on the destruction caused by Faiello's addiction. Maria's story, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale, her ambition and faith overshadowed by a preventable tragedy. In the years that followed, Maria's family carried their loss quietly, their faith sustaining them. Father Diaz spoke of her as a woman who inspired others, her memory honored in the Philippines and New York. Faiello, in interview, expressed remorse, claiming Maria's forgiving nature inspired him to change. "Not a day passes that I do not think of her or her family," he said, but his words offered little comfort to those who knew Maria. The case left a lasting mark on New York, prompting calls for stricter regulations in the cosmetic industry. For Maria Cruz, a woman who chased her dreams across an ocean, her life ended not in a hospital or a battlefield, but in a makeshift office, at the hands of a man who played God with a needle and a lie. Story 4. The summer of 1892 in Sydney, Australia, was a time of unrelenting heat, the kind that clung to the skin and made the air feel heavy with secrets. The city, a vibrant outpost of the British Empire, pulsed with the energy of a young nation. Its harbors alive with ships unloading exotic goods, its streets echoing with the clop of hooves and the shouts of hawkers selling everything from fresh fish to hand-stitched linens. In the working-class suburb of Redfern, where terraced houses stood shoulder to shoulder and the scent of coal smoke hung in the air, life was both ordinary and precarious. Families scraped by, their days filled with labor and small joys, their nights haunted by the uncertainties of a colonial world. But beneath this everyday rhythm, a darkness was taking root, one that would soon cast a long shadow over Sydney and etch itself into the annals of its criminal history. At the center of this darkness were John and Sarah Macon, a couple whose unremarkable exterior concealed a monstrous truth, and the fragile lives of infants like Horace Murray, whose brief existence would expose their crimes to a horrified nation. Sarah Jane Macon was a woman shaped by the hardships of her era. Born on December 20th, 1845, in a small town in New South Wales, she had grown up in a world where survival demanded resilience. Her sharp cheekbones and tightly pinned auburn hair gave her an air of stern practicality, but her eyes held a flicker of weariness, as if life had asked too much of her. Her husband, John Sidney Macon, born 10 months earlier on February 14, 1845, was a man of restless ambition. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of years spent laboring, first as a drayman, then as a small-time entrepreneur, but his quick smile and easy charm could disarm even the most skeptical. Together, they had raised 7 children in a modest terrace at 109 George Street in Redfern, a home that, to neighbors, seemed like any other. The Macons were known for their bustling household, their children's laughter spilling into the street, but behind closed doors, they were weaving a web of deceit that would unravel with devastating consequences. By 1892, the Macons had turned to a trade that thrived in the shadows of Victorian morality, baby farming. In an era when illegitimacy was a scarlet letter, unmarried mothers faced crushing social and economic pressures. With no safety net, many were forced to give up their newborns, entrusting them to strangers who promised care or adoption for a fee. The Macons capitalized on this desperation, placing advertisements in newspapers like the Evening News, offering to take in infants for sums ranging from £2 to £10. To desperate mothers, they presented themselves as a lifeline, a respectable couple willing to raise a child as their own. But the truth was far more sinister. The infants entrusted to their care rarely survived, their tiny lives extinguished to make way for the next payment, the next child. One such infant was Horace Amber Murray, born in April 1892 to a young woman named Amber Murray. Amber was just 19, a domestic servant whose life had been upended by an unplanned pregnancy. Living in a cramped boarding house in Summer Hill, a suburb not far from Redfern, she faced a future of shame and poverty. Her employer, a stern widow who ran a tight household, had made it clear that a baby would not be tolerated. Amber's options were few, and the weight of her situation pressed heavily on her thin shoulders. She loved her son, a boy with soft brown eyes and a quiet disposition, but she knew she could not provide for him. When she saw the Macons' advertisement in the Evening News, "Wanted kind lady to adopt baby boy," it felt like an answer to her prayers. On April 27, 1892, she arranged to meet the couple at the home of Mrs. Elizabeth Terry, the midwife who had delivered Horace at her Fleet Street residence in Summer Hill. The meeting was brief but reassuring. John Macon, with his warm smile and gentle voice, spoke of their desire to adopt a child to fill the void left by the death of their own son, Johnny. Sarah, her hands folded neatly in her lap, nodded in agreement, her expression one of quiet compassion. Their teenage daughter, Daisy, stood by their side, her presence lending an air of familial warmth. "We'll treat him as our own," Sarah promised, her voice steady and convincing. Amber, clutching Horace's tiny hand, felt a surge of relief. She handed over her son and £5, a sum that had taken weeks to scrape together, trusting that the Macons would give Horace the life she could not. As she watched them leave, John carrying the bundled infant in his arms, Amber allowed herself to hope that her son would grow up loved and safe. That hope was a cruel illusion. Within weeks, Horace was dead, his life snuffed out with a precision that spoke to the Macon's chilling efficiency. The exact method of his death would later be a matter of speculation, but the evidence pointed to a horrific act. A large needle, possibly a hat pin, driven into his heart, leaving faint bloodstains on his tiny clothes. Horace was not the only victim. The Macons had taken in at least 15 infants over the course of their operation, each handed over by mothers desperate for a solution to their plight. Instead of care, the children met a swift and silent end, their bodies buried in the backyards of the Macons' various residences. The couple moved frequently, renting homes in Redfern, Leichhardt, and Newtown, each new address a fresh canvas for their crimes. The yard at 109, George Street, became a hidden graveyard, its soil concealing the remains of children whose names would never be fully known. The Macons' carefully constructed facade began to crumble in October 1892, when a laborer digging in the backyard of a house at 25 Bond Street, McDonaldtown, made a gruesome discovery. His shovel struck something soft, and as he brushed away the dirt, he uncovered the decomposed remains of 2 infants, wrapped in tattered cloth. The police were summoned, their boots sinking into the damp earth as they excavated further. The horror multiplied. 5 tiny bodies were pulled from the ground, their fragile forms barely recognizable. The discovery sent shockwaves through Sydney, a city unaccustomed to such grotesque revelations. The house at Bond Street had been rented by the Macons until recently, and as police traced their movements, they uncovered more remains. 10 additional infants buried in the yards of homes in Redfern, Leichhardt, and Newtown. The press, seizing on the bloodstains found on the infants' clothing, dubbed the case the Hatpin Murders, a name that captured the public's horrified fascination with the suspected method of killing. John and Sarah Macon were arrested on October 28, 1892, their faces grim as they were led away in handcuffs. The city buzzed with disbelief, neighbors whispering about the couple who had seemed so ordinary, the man who tipped his hat to passers-by, the woman who hung laundry in the yard with her daughters. At the coroner's court, inquests laid bare the extent of their operation. Mothers like Amber Murray took the stand, their voices breaking as they recounted their trust in the Macons' promises. Amber, now working as a servant in Cook's River, described the day she handed over Horace, her eyes glistening with tears as she spoke of her hope for his future. "They said they'd be very kind to him," she told the court, her voice barely above a whisper. Other mothers shared similar stories, payments of small sums, assurances of love and care, and children who vanished without a trace. The inquests painted a picture of a calculated scheme, one that preyed on the most vulnerable and profited from their desperation. The trial began on March 6, 1893, at the Central Criminal Court in Darlinghurst, a grand sandstone building that loomed over Sydney's skyline. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation as reporters scribbled furiously and spectators craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the accused. John and Sarah faced charges of feloniously and maliciously murdering Horace Amber Murray, with an additional charge concerning an unidentified infant, a safeguard in case the first charge failed on a technicality. The Macons pleaded not guilty, their defense led by Thomas Williamson, a solicitor who argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that no direct proof linked the couple to Horace's death. John sat in the dock, his arms and legs crossed, his face a mask of indifference, as if the proceedings were a minor inconvenience. Sarah, by contrast, hid her face behind a handkerchief, her shoulders trembling as the prosecution laid out its case. Crown Prosecutor John Healy, a seasoned advocate with a commanding presence, admitted that the case was extraordinary and unique, but he was confident the jury would reach a guilty verdict. Amber Murray's testimony was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. She stood before the court, her simple dress and downcast eyes a stark contrast to the gravity of her words. She recounted the meeting with the Macons, the promises they made, and the moment she handed over her son. Her voice faltered as she described the £5 she had paid, a sum that represented weeks of scrimping and sacrifice. Other mothers followed, their stories echoing Amber's. Agnes Ward, who had given her son Charles to the Macons for £5, another who had paid £3 for the care of her daughter, only to learn she was buried in a Leichhardt yard. The forensic evidence was chilling. Bloodstains on the infant's clothing suggested a needle or hatpin as the murder weapon, and the sheer number of bodies found in the Macons' former residences pointed to a pattern of deliberate killing. Justice Alfred Stephen, a towering figure in Australian law, presided over the trial with a stern impartiality. His decision to allow evidence of the other infant's deaths sparked heated debate among legal scholars, as it was a departure from strict evidentiary rules. Stephen justified his ruling with an appeal to common sense, arguing that the pattern of deaths was relevant to proving the Macons' intent. The decision would later be upheld by the Privy Council, setting a precedent that evidence of a defendant's other crimes could be admitted to establish guilt. The jury, a panel of 12 men from Sydney's working class, listened intently as the prosecution wove together the threads of the case. The advertisements, the payments, the buried bodies, and the bloodstains that spoke of unspeakable cruelty. The defense fought back, with Williamson challenging the identification of Horace's body and the lack of direct evidence of his cause of death. He argued that the Macons were victims of circumstance, their frequent moves a necessity of their precarious finances rather than a means to conceal crimes. But the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The jury retired at 5 p.m. on March 8, 1893, their faces grim as they filed out of the courtroom. The city held its breath, the trial dominating headlines and conversations in pubs and parlors. At 9 p.m., the foreman informed Justice Stephen that they were unlikely to reach a verdict that night, and the jury was locked up in a nearby hotel, their deliberations stretching into the early hours. At 10 a.m. on March 9th, the jury returned, their faces etched with exhaustion. The foreman announced the verdict: guilty of the murder of Horace Murray for both John and Sarah Macon. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but the jury added an unexpected plea: mercy for Sarah, perhaps swayed by her tears or the societal belief that women were less capable of such heinous acts. Justice Stephen, his face stern, deferred sentencing pending an appeal on the admissibility of the other infants' deaths. The appeal, heard by the full bench of the Supreme Court on March 30th, was a battle of legal minds. Williamson argued that the evidence of the other bodies was prejudicial, that it tainted the jury's view of the Macons' guilt in Horace's case. But Justice Windier, in a 27-page judgment joined by Justice Foster, upheld the convictions, dismissing the appeal. Justice Innes dissented in part, questioning the admissibility of the other deaths, but concurred that the guilty verdict should stand. On March 31, 1893, the Macons returned to the courtroom for sentencing. The air was heavy with anticipation, the gallery packed with spectators eager to see justice served. John stood tall, his face pale but composed, as Justice Stephen sentenced him to death by hanging. Sarah, her eyes red from crying, received the same sentence, but a wave of public sympathy, fueled by her gender and the jury's recommendation, prompted a swift response. Petitions circulated, and within days, her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment with hard labor, to be served at Darlinghurst Jail. John's fate was sealed. On August 15, 1893, he was led to the gallows at the same jail, his final moments marked by a stoic silence. Sarah, confined to a cell, faced years of grueling labor, her name forever tied to the horror she had helped perpetrate. She was released in 1911 after serving 18 years and died on September 13, 1918, a broken woman shunned by society. The Macon case left an indelible mark on Sydney, its horror exposing the underbelly of a society that turned a blind eye to the plight of unmarried mothers. The discovery of 15 infant bodies forced Australia to confront the reality of baby farming, a practice that thrived in the shadows of Victorian morality. Newspapers called for reform, demanding stricter oversight of adoptions and greater support for vulnerable women. Amber Murray, whose testimony had been pivotal, retreated from public view, her life forever altered by the loss of her son. She carried the weight of her decision, the guilt of trusting the Macons, and the pain of knowing Horace's fate. The other mothers, too, bore their grief in silence, their stories a testament to the cost of societal shame. The case resonated far beyond 1893, its legacy woven into Australia's cultural and legal fabric. The Macon's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked greed and the vulnerability of those society casts aside. In Redfern, the houses where the Macons had lived stood as silent memorials to the tragedy. The yard at 109 George Street, once a graveyard, was paved over, but the memory of the infants buried there lingered. Horace Murray, a boy who never had the chance to grow, became a symbol of the innocence lost to the Macons' cruelty. His mother, Amber, lived on, her life a quiet struggle to find meaning in the wake of loss. The city moved forward, its streets filling with new voices, new dreams, but the story of Sarah and John Macon endured, a haunting reminder of the fragility of trust, the cost of desperation, and the lives snuffed out in the name of profit. Story 5. The neon lights of Club 616 flickered against the humid night air of Lantana, Florida, on November 7, 1997, casting a glow that spilled onto the cracked pavement of the parking lot. Inside, the bar pulsed with the rhythm of a jukebox, the clink of glasses, and the low hum of conversation. William Earl Molt, a 40-year-old mortgage broker known to his friends as Bill, sat at a corner table, nursing a drink. He was a quiet man, not one for the nightlife, but tonight he had ventured out, seeking a break from the routine of his suburban life. His sandy hair caught the dim light, and his reserved demeanor set him apart from the boisterous crowd. At 9:30 p.m., he picked up his phone, his fingers steady despite the drinks he'd had, and called his girlfriend, Cheryl. "I'll be home soon," he said, his voice calm, reassuring. She smiled through the phone, picturing him in his white 1994 Saturn SL, winding through the familiar streets of Lantana. But as the clock ticked past 11 p.m., and Bill's car never pulled into the driveway, a quiet unease began to settle over Cheryl's heart. Bill Molt, a man who lived a life of quiet predictability, had vanished into the night. Bill's life was one of steady, unassuming routine. Born in 1957, he grew up in Brooklyn, New York, before moving to Florida in his 20s, drawn by the promise of warm winters and new opportunities. He settled in Lantana, a small coastal town where palm trees swayed against the backdrop of strip malls and quiet neighborhoods. As a mortgage broker, Bill was meticulous, his days spent poring over paperwork, helping families secure their slice of the American dream. He wasn't flashy. His wardrobe consisted of khakis and polo shirts, his car a practical sedan. But he was reliable, the kind of man who always called when he said he would. He shared a modest home with Cheryl, their relationship a steady anchor in a world that could feel chaotic. They weren't married, but their bond was deep, built on shared evenings watching TV and planning for a future that seemed just within reach. Bill had no enemies, no dark secrets, at least none that anyone knew. To those who loved him, his disappearance was not just a mystery, but an impossibility. The morning of November 8, 1997, dawned with a heavy stillness. Cheryl woke to an empty bed, her worry from the night before now a gnawing panic. She called Bill's phone, but it rang unanswered, the sound echoing in her ears like a warning. She contacted his family, his brother Robert and sister Linda, who lived nearby, and together they retraced his steps. The staff at Club 616 confirmed what Cheryl already knew. Bill had been there, quiet as always, sipping a few drinks but showing no signs of intoxication. He left alone around 11 p.m., climbing into his Saturn, the engine humming as he pulled out of the lot. No one saw anything unusual, no arguments, no suspicious figures lurking in the shadows. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole, car and all. By midday, Cheryl and Bill's family reported him missing to the Lantana Police Department. Officer Maria Delgado, a young but determined detective, took the initial report, her pen moving quickly as she noted the details. 40 years old, 5 feet 10 inches, medium build, last seen driving a white Saturn SL. She visited Club 616, interviewing bartenders and patrons, but their stories were consistent. Bill was unremarkable, a man who kept to himself. Delgado drove the route from the club to Bill's home, a 15-minute stretch along Lantana Road, scanning for any sign of a crash or abandoned vehicle. The roads were clear, the ditches empty. She called in a helicopter unit to sweep the area from above, their blades slicing through the humid air as they searched canals and wooded lots. Nothing. The case, barely a day old, was already slipping toward the cold, unyielding grip of the unknown. For Cheryl, the days that followed were a blur of anguish and action. She plastered missing person flyers across Lantana, Bill's face smiling back from telephone poles and storefront windows. His photo, taken at a family barbecue the previous summer, showed a man with kind eyes and a shy smile, his arm around Cheryl. Missing, William Earl Molt, the flyers read, listing his height, weight, and the details of his car. Friends and neighbors joined the effort, combing fields and checking local businesses, their footsteps heavy with hope that faded with each passing hour. Robert, Bill's older brother, took to knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a white Saturn or heard anything unusual that night. Linda, his sister, sat with Cheryl at night, the two women clutching coffee mugs as they tried to make sense of the impossible. "He wouldn't just leave," Cheryl said, her voice breaking. "Something happened to him." The Lantana police, under pressure from a community rattled by the disappearance, expanded their investigation. Delgado and her partner, Detective James Carter, considered every possibility. Was Bill the victim of a robbery gone wrong? There was no evidence of a struggle, no blood or debris at the club's parking lot. Had he chosen to disappear, overwhelmed by some unseen pressure? His bank accounts showed no unusual activity, and his personal life, by all accounts, was stable. Carter suggested a car accident, a plausible scenario given the dark, winding roads around Lantana. But searches of nearby highways, canals, and retention ponds, common in Florida's low-lying landscape, yielded nothing. The police checked hospitals, jails, even homeless shelters, but Bill's name appeared nowhere. The case began to cool, the initial urgency giving way to the slow grind of an unsolved mystery. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The world moved on, but for Cheryl and the Molt family, time stood still. They held vigils on the anniversary of Bill's disappearance, gathering at a local church where candles flickered against the evening sky. Cheryl kept Bill's belongings untouched, his favorite jacket hanging in the closet, his paperwork stacked neatly on his desk, as if preserving them might somehow bring him back. She visited a psychic once, desperate for answers, but the vague promises of closure only deepened her frustration. The media, initially eager to cover the story, moved on to other tragedies, leaving Bill's case to fade into the archives. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System listed him as case number MP20695, a sterile designation that belied the human toll of his absence. In the years that followed, Lantana changed. The small town grew, its quiet streets giving way to new developments and bustling subdivisions. The Grand Isles, a housing community in nearby Wellington, about 20 miles from Lantana, sprang up in the late 1990s, its manicured lawns and modern homes a symbol of Florida's booming real estate market. A retention pond, dug to manage stormwater, sat at the edge of the neighborhood, its murky waters reflecting the sky. No one paid it much attention. It was just another feature of the suburban landscape, a place where children tossed stones and egrets waded in the shallows. But beneath its surface, hidden from view, lay a secret that would remain buried for over 2 decades. The breakthrough came in August 2019, in a way that seemed almost too surreal to be true. Barry Fay, a 50-year-old resident of the Grand Isles, was at home one evening when he received a call from a former neighbor, a man who had moved away years earlier. The former neighbor, idly browsing Google Earth to reminisce about his old home, had zoomed in on the retention pond at Moon Bay Circle. There, in the satellite imagery, was something unmistakable. The outline of a car, its white roof barely visible beneath the water's surface. "You should check it out," he told Fay, his voice tinged with curiosity. Fay, skeptical but intrigued, borrowed a drone from a friend and flew it over the pond. The drone's camera confirmed it, a vehicle submerged and calcified, its shape eerily clear against the muddy bottom. Faye's heart sank as he dialed the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, unaware that he was about to unravel a mystery that had haunted a family for 22 years. On August 28, 2019, deputies arrived at Moon Bay Circle, their vehicles lining the quiet street as curious neighbors gathered. A dive team suited up, their equipment clanking as they descended into the pond's murky depths. The water was thick with sediment, visibility near zero, but the divers worked methodically, their hands probing the mud until they felt the hard edge of a car. It was a 1994 Saturn SL, its once white exterior now encrusted with algae and corrosion. As the tow truck pulled the vehicle from the water, its frame groaned, water pouring from its shattered windows. Inside, the divers found skeletal remains, the bones brittle and weathered by years underwater. The discovery sent a chill through the crowd, and for Cheryl, who was notified by phone, it was a moment of both closure and renewed grief. "I knew he didn't leave me," she whispered to Linda, tears streaming down her face. The Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's office took over, using dental records to confirm what everyone suspected. The remains were those of William Earl Molt. The car matched the description of Bill's Saturn, and the location, though 20 miles from Lantana, was plausible given the route he might have taken that night. The Grand Isles had been under construction in 1997, its roads unpaved and poorly lit, the retention pond a new feature with no barriers or signs to warn drivers. Sheriff spokesperson Terry Barbera spoke to the press, her voice measured but somber. "We believe he lost control of his vehicle and drove into the pond," she said, citing the lack of evidence for foul play. "The exact circumstances may never be known, but he's been found." The explanation was simple, almost painfully so: a tragic accident, a moment of misjudgment in the dark, and a life lost to the unforgiving waters. The discovery was both a resolution and a revelation. The car had been visible on Google Earth since at least 2007, its image captured in satellite photos that anyone could access. Yet, for 12 years, it had gone unnoticed, a silent testament to the limits of human observation. The former neighbor's chance discovery, prompted by nostalgia, had done what years of police searches could not. The story made headlines, from the BBC to the Washington Post, with outlets marveling at the role of technology in solving a decades-old mystery. The Charlie Project, an online database of missing persons, updated Bill's profile to Resolved, noting the eerie fact that his car had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. "It's heartbreaking," Cheryl told a reporter from the Palm Beach Post, her voice heavy with the weight of 22 years. "He was right there, and we didn't know." For the Molt family, the discovery brought answers, but also new questions. How had Bill ended up in Wellington, so far from his usual route? Had he taken a wrong turn, disoriented by the drinks or the unfamiliar roads? The police found no evidence of intoxication beyond the few drinks he'd had, and witnesses at the club insisted he seemed sober when he left. Some speculated that the construction in the Grand Isles, with its unmarked roads and open lots, had confused him, leading him to the pond's edge. Others wondered if he'd been distracted, perhaps by a phone call or a moment of fatigue. The lack of skid marks or defensive damage to the car suggested he hadn't tried to stop, a detail that haunted Cheryl. "Did he even know what was happening?" she asked Robert one night, her voice barely audible. The community of Lantana, too, was shaken by the news. Neighbors who had known Bill gathered at a local diner, sharing memories of a man who was kind but reserved, always quick with a smile. The Grand Isles residents, many of whom had lived there for years, were stunned to learn a car had been in their pond all along. Lori Martin, who lived across from the pond, spoke to ABC 11, her voice tinged with disbelief. "They came knocking on our door and asked how long we'd been here," she said. "We told them 9 years, and they said, 'Did you know there was a car in the lake?'" The revelation sparked conversations about the unseen dangers of retention ponds, common in Florida but rarely secured, and the power of technology to uncover what human eyes had missed. Cheryl and the Molt family held a small memorial for Bill in September 2019, a quiet gathering at the church where they had once held vigils. They scattered his ashes in the Atlantic Ocean, the waves lapping gently as Cheryl spoke of his love for the sea. "He's at peace now," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. The closure was bittersweet, a resolution that came too late to heal the years of pain, but offered a chance to move forward. Cheryl kept one of Bill's flyers, its edges worn from years of handling, as a reminder of the man she'd loved and the mystery that had defined her life for so long. The case of William Earl Moult became a touchstone for discussions about missing persons and the role of technology in solving cold cases. Groups like Adventures with Purpose, a YouTube channel dedicated to finding submerged vehicles, cited Bill's case as an example of how sonar and drones could aid investigations. The story also highlighted the challenges of searching Florida's waterways, where murky ponds and shifting water levels could hide evidence for decades. For Detective Delgado, now a seasoned investigator, the case was a reminder of the limits of her early efforts. "We looked everywhere we could," she told a colleague, her voice heavy with regret. "But sometimes the answers are just out of reach. The retention pond at Moon Bay Circle is still there, its surface calm, its secrets now revealed. The Grand Isles has grown, its homes filled with families who know little of the tragedy that unfolded before their neighborhood existed. But for those who loved Bill Moult, the pond is a place of quiet reverence, a marker of a life lost and a mystery solved." Cheryl visits sometimes, standing at the water's edge, her thoughts drifting to that November night. She imagines Bill's car slipping into the darkness, the water closing over it, and wonders what he felt in those final moments. The answers may never come, but the truth, uncovered by a chance glance at a satellite image, has given her a measure of peace, a fragile gift after 22 years of waiting. Story 6. The Miami sun blazed down on the tarmac of Miami International Airport, its heat shimmering in waves that distorted the air above the asphalt. It was August 2nd, 1982, and the parking lot was a sprawling maze of cars baking under the relentless Florida sky. A faint, putrid odor wafted through the air, unnoticed at first by the travelers hurrying to their flights or dragging luggage to their vehicles. It wasn't until a parking attendant, wiping sweat from his brow, paused near a nondescript Cadillac sedan that he caught the smell, a sickly, unmistakable stench that made his stomach churn. Curious, he approached the car, peering through the tinted windows. Nothing seemed amiss at first glance, but the odor was stronger here, seeping from the trunk. His heart quickened as he called for security, a sinking feeling telling him this was no ordinary abandoned vehicle. When the police arrived, they pried open the trunk, and the sight that greeted them would haunt them for years. Stuffed inside, his body contorted and stiff with rigor mortis, was John Callahan, a 45-year-old businessman from Boston. His face, once handsome and charismatic, was frozen in a grimace of death, a bullet wound marring his temple. The blood had pooled and dried, staining the carpeted interior of the trunk. The officers exchanged grim looks. This was no random act of violence. The execution-style killing suggested something deeper, something tied to the shadowy underworld that Callahan, unbeknownst to many, had been entangled in for years. John Callahan had been a man of contradictions. To the world, he was a successful entrepreneur, the former president of World Jaya Lai, a sports betting empire that drew crowds to its fast-paced games in Florida and beyond. He was a charmer, with a quick smile and a knack for making people feel at ease. But beneath the polished exterior was a man who had brushed shoulders with some of Boston's most dangerous criminals, men whose names carried weight in the city's underworld. James Whitey Bulger and Stephen the Rifleman Fleming, leaders of the infamous Winter Hill Gang. Callahan's life, and ultimately his death, would unravel a web of corruption, betrayal, and a chilling alliance between organized crime and the very agency tasked with stopping it. John Callahan was born in 1937 in a working-class neighborhood of Boston, where the cobblestone streets and triple-decker homes told stories of Irish immigrants who had carved out lives in a new world. He was a scrappy kid, quick-witted and ambitious, with dreams bigger than the cramped apartment he shared with his parents and siblings. By the time he was in his 20s, Callahan had a reputation for being a hustler, not in the criminal sense, at least not yet, but as someone who could talk his way into any room and out of any trouble. He had a natural charisma, a gift for reading people, and an unyielding drive to make something of himself. His early years were marked by small ventures, running errands for local bookies, brokering deals in Boston's bustling bar scene, anything to keep money in his pocket. But Callahan wanted more than a hustler's life. He wanted respect, power, the kind of success that turned heads. In the 1970s, he found his opportunity in an unlikely place. Jai-alai, a sport that combined athleticism with high-stakes gambling. World Jai-alai, a company operating front-ends in Florida, Connecticut, and Nevada, was a goldmine for those who could navigate its murky waters. Callahan, with his sharp mind and easy charm, was hired to manage its Miami operations, eventually rising to president and CEO. In Miami, Callahan thrived. He traded Boston's gray winters for palm-lined streets and oceanfront views, settling into a life of tailored suits and late-night deals. World Jai-alai's front-ends were electric, arenas where players slung a hard ball, the pelota, at blinding speeds while spectators bet feverishly on the outcome. Callahan was in his element, schmoozing with high rollers, overseeing operations, and ensuring the cash kept flowing. But the money that fueled Jai-alai also attracted a darker crowd. Bookies, loan sharks, and mobsters saw the sport as a perfect front for their activities, and Callahan, ever pragmatic, didn't shy away from doing business with them. Among those drawn to World Jai-alai were members of the Winter Hill Gang, a Boston-based criminal organization that ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist. At its helm was James Whitey Bulger, a man whose name alone could silence a room. With his piercing blue eyes and quiet menace, Bulger was a paradox, a calculating strategist who could be charming one moment and lethal the next. His partner, Stephen Flemmi, known as the Rifleman for his marksmanship, was equally formidable, a loyal enforcer who carried out Bulger's orders with ruthless efficiency. Together, they ran a sprawling empire of illegal gambling, extortion, and drug trafficking, and World Jai-alai was a tempting target. Callahan's relationship with Bulger and Flemmi began innocently enough. A few meetings, some shared drinks, a mutual understanding that business could be mutually beneficial. Callahan saw them as necessary evils, men who could ensure his operations ran smoothly in exchange for a cut of the profits. What he didn't realize was that Bulger and Flemmi were not just criminals. They were untouchable, shielded by a secret that would later shake the foundations of law enforcement. They were FBI informants, part of the Bureau's top echelon program, designed to infiltrate La Cosa Nostra, the Italian mafia. Their handler, FBI agent John Connolly, a South Boston native who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Bulger, saw them as his ticket to glory. In exchange for information on their rivals, Connolly and his supervisor, John Morris, turned a blind eye to their crimes, creating a dangerous alliance that would have deadly consequences. By 1981, the cracks in Callahan's carefully constructed world were beginning to show. He had discovered that money was disappearing from World Jai-alai, large sums siphoned off by various individuals with ties to the Winter Hill Gang. Bulger and Flemmi, along with their associates, were skimming profits, treating the company as their personal ATM. Callahan, who prided himself on his business savvy, was furious but cautious. Confronting men like Bulger and Flemmi directly was out of the question. Their reputation for violence was well known. Instead, he turned to Paul Rico, World Jai-alai's head of security and a former FBI agent who had deep connections to both the Bureau and the underworld. Rico was a complex figure, a man who had spent decades navigating the gray area between law and crime. In the 1960s, he had been instrumental in recruiting Flemmi as an informant, laying the groundwork for the FBI's relationship with the Winter Hill Gang. Now, as a private security consultant, he was supposed to protect World Jai-alai's interests, but his loyalties were murky at best. Callahan confided in Rico about the skimming, hoping he could intervene discreetly. It was a fateful mistake, one that placed Callahan squarely in the crosshairs of men who valued silence above all else. The stakes rose higher when Roger Wheeler, the chairman of World GLI, was murdered on May 27, 1981. Wheeler, a Tulsa businessman who had taken a hands-on approach to the company, had also grown suspicious of the missing profits. On a sunny afternoon, as he stepped out of his car at his country club, a gunman approached and shot him dead. The killing was professional, a single bullet to the head, and it sent shockwaves through World GLI. Callahan, already on edge, couldn't shake the feeling that Wheeler's death was tied to the skimming operation. He voiced his concerns to Rico, unaware that Rico's allegiance lay with the very men Callahan feared. The FBI, meanwhile, was closing in, not on Bulger and Flemmy, but on Callahan himself. Agents in Oklahoma, investigating Wheeler's murder, had learned of Callahan's ties to the Winter Hill Gang and suspected he might have information. They wanted to question him, but their efforts were thwarted by the Boston field office, where Connolly and Morris held sway. The Boston agents, protective of their prized informants, blocked attempts to interview Bulger and Flemmy, citing their value to ongoing investigations. It was a lie, one designed to shield the gang from scrutiny, while allowing them to continue their reign of terror. Callahan's paranoia grew. He began drinking heavily, his once confident demeanor replaced by a jittery unease. He told friends he was planning to leave Miami, to escape the shadow of the Winter Hill Gang, and start over somewhere far away. But Bulger and Flemmy had other plans. Through their FBI handlers, they learned that Callahan was a potential liability. He knew too much about the skimming, about Wheeler's murder, and about their protected status as informants. If he talked, he could bring their empire crashing down. The decision was made. Callahan had to go. The night of July 31st, 1982, was warm and humid, the kind of Miami evening where the air felt like a heavy blanket. John Callahan drove his Cadillac to a meeting, believing it was a routine business discussion. The details of who lured him there remain unclear, lost in the fog of the underworld, but the man waiting for him was no stranger. John Martirano, a hitman for the Winter Hill Gang, was a professional killer with a reputation for getting the job done. Stocky and unassuming, with a face that betrayed no emotion, Martirano was the perfect weapon for Bulger and Flemmy's dirty work. What happened next was swift and brutal. In a van, away from prying eyes, Martirano raised his gun and fired a single shot into Callahan's head. The bullet tore through his skull, killing him instantly. There was no struggle, no chance for Callahan to plead or fight. Martirano, with the cold efficiency of a man who had killed before, transferred the body to the trunk of Callahan's Cadillac. The car was driven to Miami International Airport, where it was abandoned in the long-term parking lot, a grim tomb for a man who had once dreamed of bigger things. Martirano vanished, leaving no trace of his presence, confident that the body would go undiscovered for days. It was the parking attendant's discovery on August 2nd that set the investigation in motion. The Miami-Dade Police Department descended on the scene, their faces grim as they processed the crime. The execution-style killing pointed to a professional hit, but the motive was elusive. Callahan's ties to World GLI and the Winter Hill Gang were known, but proving a connection was another matter. The police interviewed associates, combed through financial records, and canvassed the airport, but the trail was cold. The FBI, which should have been a partner in the investigation, was curiously distant, offering little help beyond vague promises to look into it. For Mary Jane Callahan, the months following her husband's murder were a descent into grief and frustration. A soft-spoken woman with warm brown eyes and a quiet strength, Mary Jane had been John's partner in every sense, his confidant, his anchor, the mother of their two children, Kathleen and Patrick. She had known about his dealings with unsavory characters, but had always believed he could handle himself. Now, faced with his death, she was determined to find answers. Mary Jane hounded the police and the FBI, calling daily to demand updates. But the responses she received were maddeningly vague. "We're following leads," one detective told her, his tone flat. "Don't believe everything you read in the papers," an FBI agent advised. brushing off her questions about news reports linking John's death to organized crime. The more she pushed, the more she sensed a wall of resistance, as if the truth was being deliberately withheld. Behind the scenes, the FBI's Boston field office was working to protect Bulger and Fleming. John Connolly, whose loyalty to his informants bordered on obsession, had tipped them off about the Oklahoma agent's interest in Callahan. He ensured that any inquiries about the Winter Hill Gang were rerouted or buried, citing the need to protect ongoing operations. His supervisor, John Morris, was complicit, accepting bribes and favors that deepened the FBI's entanglement with the gang. In one egregious instance, Morris had accepted a plane ticket for his secretary to join him in Georgia for a romantic getaway, paid for by Bulger and Fleming. The corruption ran deep, a betrayal of the badge that allowed murderers to walk free. Mary Jane, unaware of the full extent of the cover-up, hired private investigators and pored over every scrap of information she could find. She read news articles, tracked down former colleagues of John's, and even reached out to World Jaya Lai employees, hoping for a clue. But the underworld was a closed book, and those who knew the truth were either too scared or too loyal to talk. The years dragged on, and the case grew cold, leaving Mary Jane to raise her children alone, haunted by the question of who had taken her husband's life. The turning point came in 1999, when John Martirano, facing a litany of charges for his role in the Winter Hill Gang's crimes, decided to cooperate with prosecutors. Martirano was no stranger to violence. He had killed at least 20 people, including Callahan, with a chilling detachment. But with the prospect of life in prison looming, he saw a plea deal as his only way out. On September 9, 1999, parts of his agreement were made public, and the revelation was explosive. Martirano admitted to killing John Callahan on orders from Bulger and Fleming, who feared he would expose their skimming operation and their status as FBI informants. The confession sent shockwaves through Boston and beyond. For Mary Jane, it was a moment of vindication tinged with pain. She had always suspected that John's death was tied to the Winter Hill Gang, but hearing it confirmed brought no comfort, only a renewed determination to hold those responsible accountable. Martirano's testimony opened the floodgates, exposing the FBI's complicity in protecting Bulger and Fleming. John Connolly, once a respected agent, was indicted for racketeering and obstruction of justice, accused of tipping off his informants about investigations that threatened them. John Morris, granted immunity, testified against Connolly, admitting to accepting bribes and failing to rein in the gang's violence. The Callahan family, led by Mary Jane, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the United States in 2002, arguing that the FBI's negligence and misconduct had directly led to John's murder. The lawsuit, brought under the Federal Tort Claims Act, alleged that the FBI had created a protective shield around Bulger and Fleming, emboldening them to commit crimes with impunity. It also claimed that the FBI had engaged in fraudulent concealment, withholding critical information about the murder to protect their informants. The case was a bold move, pitting a grieving family against the federal government, but Mary Jane was undeterred. The legal battle was arduous. The government moved to dismiss the claims, arguing that the family had failed to file their administrative claim within the 2-year statute of limitations required by the FTCA. Mary Jane's lawyers countered that the FBI's concealment had prevented her from discovering the truth in time, a claim bolstered by Martirano's plea and subsequent revelations. But the court ruled that the statute of limitations had expired by October 1, 1999, when Martirano's plea became public knowledge. The dismissal was a crushing blow, leaving Mary Jane and her children without the justice they had sought for so long. As the Callahan family's legal fight faltered, the criminal case against Bulger and Fleming gained traction. Martirano's testimony, combined with that of other defectors, painted a vivid picture of the Winter Hill Gang's reign of terror. Bulger, who had fled Boston in 1994 after Connolly tipped him off about an impending indictment, became one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives. For 16 years, he lived as a ghost, hiding in plain sight in Santa Monica, California, under the alias Charlie Gasco. When he was finally captured in 2011, his trial captivated the nation. The courtroom was a theater of contrasts. Bulger, now an old man with thinning white hair, sat defiantly as prosecutors laid out his crimes. 19 murders, including Callahan's, along with racketeering, extortion, and drug trafficking. Witnesses, including former associates and victims' families, recounted tales of betrayal and bloodshed. Bulger's defense was weak, relying on his claim that he was not an informant, a lie that crumbled under the weight of evidence. In 2013, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years. 5 years later, he was beaten to death in a West Virginia prison, his death as violent as the life he had led. Stephen Flemmi, less elusive than Bulger, pleaded guilty in 2004 to 12 murders, including Callahan's. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he remains, a relic of a bygone era of organized crime. John Connolly faced his own reckoning. Convicted in 2002 for racketeering and obstruction of justice, he was later charged in Florida with second-degree murder for his role in Callahan's death. The evidence showed that Connolly had tipped Bulger and Flemmi about Callahan's potential cooperation, setting the stage for his murder. Connolly was sentenced to 40 years, a symbol of the FBI's fall from grace. The murder of John Callahan was more than a single act of violence. It was a thread in a larger tapestry of corruption and betrayal. The Winter Hill Gang, with the complicity of rogue FBI agents, had operated unchecked for decades, leaving a trail of devastation. Callahan's death, though one of many, stood out for its brazenness. A man executed and left in a trunk at a bustling airport, a stark warning to those who dared to challenge the wrong people. For Mary Jane Callahan, the convictions of Bulger, Flemmi, and Connolly were a hollow victory. They confirmed what she had long suspected, but they could not bring back her husband or erase the years of grief. The dismissal of her lawsuit was a final injustice, a reminder that the system she had trusted had failed her family. Yet she refused to be silenced, speaking out about the need for accountability and reform within the FBI. Her children, Kathleen and Patrick, carried their father's memory with them, a mix of pride for his ambition and sorrow for the choices that led to his downfall. The case sparked broader changes. Congressional hearings and internal investigations led to reforms in the FBI's informant program, aimed at preventing the kind of corruption that had protected Bulger and Flemmi. But for those who had lost loved ones, the reforms were cold comfort. The Callahan case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power, unchecked, could corrupt even those sworn to uphold the law. In Miami, the parking lot at the airport remains a place of constant motion, a hub for travelers oblivious to the tragedy that unfolded there decades ago. The Cadillac is gone, but the echoes of John Callahan's life and death linger. He was a man who chased success and found himself ensnared in a world he could not escape. His story, pieced together from court documents, news reports, and the memories of those who loved him, is one of ambition, betrayal, and a relentless quest for justice. A quest that, in the end, revealed the cost of dancing with the devil. Story 7. The morning of November 9th, 2005, broke cold and quiet in Robinson, Texas, a small town just south of Waco where the flat expanse of the plains met modest homes and tight-knit families. In a ranch-style house on Gregg Drive, Darlene Gentry, a 31-year-old nurse with long blonde hair and a beauty queen's smile, stood in her kitchen, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. Her voice, high and frantic, cracked through the receiver at 6:15 a.m. She told the operator she'd woken to find the back door ajar, the glass-fronted gun cabinet in the living room empty, and her husband, Keith, lying in their bed, his face buried in a pillow soaked with blood. "He's making a god-awful sound," she said, her words tumbling over each other as she described a scene of chaos, a robbery, she claimed, that had left her husband clinging to life. Within minutes, the quiet street filled with the wail of sirens, and officers from the Robinson Police Department burst into the home, their boots heavy on the hardwood. They found 31-year-old Keith Gentry, an engineering assistant and father of 3, unresponsive, a single gunshot wound to his head. The house, with its scattered toys and family photos, seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew the truth was far darker than Darlene's story suggested. Keith Gentry was a man of routine, a small-town boy with deep roots in McLennan County. Born in 1974 to Wayman and Glenda Gentry, he grew up in Robinson, a place where everyone knew each other, and life revolved around church, school, and family. Keith was tall, with striking blue eyes and a quiet charm that drew people to him. He met Darlene Doskasil at Texas State Technical College in Waco, where he studied drafting and welding, and she trained to become a dental assistant. Darlene, with her vivacious personality and beauty pageant poise, seemed smitten from the start. He had the most beautiful eyes, she later told investigators, her voice softening at the memory. Their romance was not without its hiccups. After 8 months of dating, Keith wasn't ready to settle down, and Darlene moved to Dallas to work for a dentist. But when her car was stolen and city life lost its shine, she returned to Robinson in 1998, and Keith, realizing he couldn't let her go, proposed. They married on April 10, 1999, in a classic Texas wedding, complete with barbecue and a dance under the stars. The couple settled next door to Keith's parents, Wayman and Glenda, in a home filled with the promise of a new life. Darlene earned a nursing degree, and Keith took a job as an engineering assistant at Brazos Electric Co-op, a position that initially kept him on the road but later brought him to a desk job closer to home. Their 3 sons, Chase, Cody, and Cade, arrived in quick succession, their laughter filling the house with joy. To neighbors, the Gentrys were the picture of a perfect family. Darlene, the former prom queen, juggled motherhood and her nursing career with grace, while Keith, a devoted father, coached Little League and took the boys fishing. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Keith's desk job left him restless, and Darlene, stretched thin by work and parenting, grew distant. Wayman noticed the strain, telling friends. They didn't seem happy anymore. Keith confided in his family that he was determined to make the marriage work for the boys, but Darlene, it seemed, had other plans. The police who arrived at the Gentry home that November morning were immediately skeptical. Detective Mike Miller, a seasoned officer with the Robinson Police Department, surveyed the scene. The back door, Darlene claimed, had been left open by intruders, but there were no signs of forced entry. No splintered wood, no broken lock. The gun cabinet, its key resting conveniently on top, was empty, but the missing rifles were found discarded on the front lawn, as if someone had staged a burglary in haste. Only one gun, a .22 caliber revolver given to Keith by his father, was unaccounted for. In the bedroom, Keith lay face down, the bullet wound in his head precise, the pillow muffling any sound. Darlene, tearful but composed, told Miller she'd been sleeping in another room with one of her sons, who was unwell, and only discovered the chaos when she woke at 6 a.m. Her story, however, didn't add up. The lack of forced entry, the neatly placed key, and the guns on the lawn suggested something far more calculated than a random robbery. Keith was rushed to Hillcrest Baptist Medical Center, where doctors fought to save him. His family gathered in the waiting room, Wayman and Glenda clinging to hope as Darlene sat nearby, her face pale. The doctor delivered grim news. The .22 caliber bullet had caused catastrophic brain damage, and Keith was pronounced brain dead later that day. Darlene, escorted to the hospital to say goodbye, wept as she stood by his bedside, but Miller, watching closely, noted her demeanor seemed rehearsed. The Gentry family, devastated, initially rallied around Darlene, refusing to believe she could be involved. Glenda told police, "You're looking in the wrong direction," her voice firm with conviction. They paid Darlene's bond when she was briefly detained for questioning, determined to support their daughter-in-law and grandsons. The investigation gained momentum on November 10th, when a search of the Gentry home revealed a chilling clue. A pair of latex gloves in the kitchen trash can, containing gunshot residue and a .22 caliber bullet casing. Forensic analysis by the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab confirmed the gloves bore DNA from both Keith and Darlene. Miller's suspicions deepened. The gloves suggested premeditation, not a panicked intruder. Darlene, questioned again, invoked her Fifth Amendment right to silence and her Sixth Amendment right to counsel, halting the interview. She hired attorney Stan Schwieger, a Waco lawyer known for his tenacity, and was released on bond. But her actions in the weeks that followed would unravel her carefully constructed narrative. Darlene's behavior after Keith's death raised red flags. She contacted Robert Pavelka, a local acquaintance who owned property near Axtell, about purchasing land with a pond. Keith always wanted a place where he could take the boys fishing, she told Pavelka, her voice bright with enthusiasm. The Gentry family, still grieving, supported her plan, believing she was seeking a fresh start for her sons, then aged 5, 3, and 2. But when Darlene abruptly told Pavelka she wanted the pond filled in, his suspicions grew. He contacted a friend in law enforcement, who alerted the Texas Rangers. On January 10, 2006, the Rangers dive team searched the pond and recovered the missing .22 caliber revolver, its serial number matching the gun Wayman had given Keith. Sensing an opportunity, the Rangers devised a sting. They had Pavelka, acting as a state agent, call Darlene and tell her he planned to drain the pond. On January 12th, unaware the gun had been found, Darlene drove to the property and waded knee-deep into the cold water, searching frantically for the weapon. Texas Rangers, hidden nearby, captured the scene on video, a damning piece of evidence that would seal her fate. On January 28, 2006, Darlene was arrested again, this time charged with capital murder. The Gentry family, who had stood by her, watched the video in stunned silence. Glenda, her heart breaking for her grandsons, told the Waco Tribune-Herald, "We believed in her, but that tape showed us the truth." The community of Robinson, a town of fewer than 10,000, was shaken. Keith, known for his kindness and dedication to his boys, had been betrayed by the woman he loved. The case dominated local headlines, with the Tribune-Herald reporting, "Robinson mourns as wife charged in husband's death." Neighbors whispered about Darlene's charm, her beauty pageant past, and the chilling possibility that she had planned the murder all along. The motive, prosecutors later argued, was rooted in a crumbling marriage and financial desperation. Keith's life insurance policy, worth $250,000, was a tempting lure for Darlene, who faced mounting credit card debt from her shopping habits. Friends noted her frequent purchases, designer clothes, jewelry, and gifts for her boys, that strained the family's budget. Keith's desk job, while stable, didn't satisfy him, and his frustration spilled into their relationship. Darlene, meanwhile, had grown restless, confiding in a co-worker that she felt trapped. Prosecutors speculated she saw Keith's death as a way to escape, collecting the insurance money to start anew. Another theory, raised during the investigation, pointed to infidelity. Darlene attempted to introduce medical records showing that Keith and a married couple had herpes, suggesting a third party might have had a motive to kill him. The court excluded this evidence, ruling it irrelevant, but the rumor of Keith's unfaithfulness lingered, a shadow cast over the marriage. The trial began on February 6, 2007, in Waco's 19th State District Court, presided over by Judge Ralph Struther. The courtroom, a modern space with wooden pews, was packed with reporters, family, and curious locals. Darlene, now 33, sat at the defense table, her blonde hair pulled back, her face pale but composed. Assistant District Attorney Crawford Long led the prosecution, presenting a case built on forensic evidence and the incriminating video. The latex gloves, with their damning residue and DNA, were a cornerstone, as was the revolver recovered from the pond. Long called the doctor who treated Keith, who confirmed the .22 caliber bullet caused his death, and the Texas Ranger who orchestrated the sting, who described Darlene's desperate search in the pond. The video, played for the jury, was a gut punch. Darlene, unaware she was being filmed, waded through the water, her movements frantic yet deliberate. Wayman, watching from the gallery, gripped Glenda's hand, his faith in his daughter-in-law shattered. Darlene's defense, led by Schwieger, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that her Sixth Amendment rights were violated by Pavelka's calls, made without her attorney present. Schwieger claimed Darlene was coerced into searching the pond, and that she was prevented from testifying to explain her actions. He suggested an intruder could have committed the crime, pointing to the open back door and the guns on the lawn. But the defense called no witnesses, resting after the prosecution's case. The jury, after 5 hours of deliberation, returned a guilty verdict on February 7, 2007. The next day, they sentenced Darlene to 60 years in prison, with eligibility for parole in 2037. Judge Struther, his voice somber, told her, "You took a life and left 3 boys without a father." The Gentry family, seated in the front row, wept quietly, their grief mingled with relief. The aftermath was a painful reckoning. Wayman and Glenda, now raising Chase, Cody, and Cade, fought for and won custody of the boys in 2010, with a court order barring Darlene from contact. The boys, then 10, 8, and 7, struggled with the loss of both parents, one to death, the other to prison. Glenda told the Tribune-Herald, "We're doing our best for them. That's what Keith would have wanted." Darlene's mother, Judy Doskasil, initially took the boys to visit her in prison, but tensions with the Gentrys led to an agreement to prioritize the children's stability. The boys, now teenagers, grew up with their grandparents' love, their father's memory preserved in photos and stories. Darlene, incarcerated at the Dr. Lane Murray unit in Gatesville, maintained her innocence, filing multiple appeals. In 2010, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ordered a hearing on her habeas corpus petition, alleging she didn't receive a fair trial. She claimed her attorneys withheld evidence and prevented her from testifying, but in January 2025, Judge Burt Richardson recommended denying a new trial, a ruling upheld by the Court of Criminal Appeals. Wayman, now in his late 60s, told the Tribune-Herald, "It's a good Thanksgiving gift for us. This part is over." Darlene, now 50, faces a maximum sentence until 2067, her parole eligibility a distant hope. The Darlene and Keith Gentry case left scars on Robinson, a reminder of betrayal hidden behind a perfect facade. The Gentry family, through their pain, found purpose in raising the boys, teaching them Keith's values of loyalty and love. A small memorial in the town's community center, dedicated to Keith, bears a plaque, "In memory of Wayman Keith Gentry, beloved father and son." The community, shaken by the loss, rallied around the boys, their support a testament to the enduring strength of small-town bonds. Darlene's story, once that of a prom queen turned nurse, became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even those closest to us can harbor secrets that destroy. Story 8. The night of February 24, 2006, was cool and quiet in Riverside, California, a sprawling city where suburban homes nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. The streets of the Arlanza neighborhood, lined with modest houses and the occasional flicker of streetlights, carried the hum of everyday life. Children's laughter fading into the evening, cars rolling slowly past, and the faint thrum of music from a nearby party. At the intersection of Geranium Place and Rutland Avenue, Crystal DeWan Patlin, her 20-year-old boyfriend, gripped the steering wheel, while her brother, Justin Theobald, 28, lounged in the back. Just ahead, their mother, Belinda Lane, drove another car, leading the way home after a family errand. The moment felt ordinary, unremarkable, a snapshot of a family bound by love and routine. But as their car rolled through the intersection at 8:40 p.m., a white Ford Expedition pulled alongside, and the night erupted into chaos. A figure emerged from the SUV, his movements swift and deliberate. The streetlight caught the glint of a semi-automatic handgun as he raised it, the barrel aimed at Crystal's car. Without warning, shots shattered the stillness, the crack of gunfire echoing through the neighborhood. Bullets tore through the Honda's windows, glass exploding inward. Crystal slumped forward, a bullet lodged in her head. One clutched his stomach, blood seeping through his fingers. Justin, unharmed but frozen in shock, screamed as the Expedition sped away, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Belinda, hearing the shots, slammed on her brakes and turned back, her heart pounding as she saw her daughter's car lurch to a stop. She leapt out, her voice breaking as she called Crystal's name, but the scene before her was a nightmare. Her daughter motionless, her boyfriend wounded, her son trembling. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the weight of what had just happened pressed down like a physical force. Belinda's screams drew neighbors from their homes, their faces pale as they gathered at the edge of the scene. Justin, his hands shaking, drove the car to a nearby store, where surveillance cameras would later capture him cradling Crystal in his arms, pleading for help. "Stay with me, Crystal," he whispered, his voice choked with panic. Paramedics arrived, their sirens cutting through the night, and rushed Crystal and Juan to Riverside Community Hospital. Belinda followed, her mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically, but Crystal's injuries were catastrophic. For 2 days, she lingered between life and death, her family gathered around her, their prayers a desperate chorus against the inevitable. On February 26, 2006, Crystal Theobald died, leaving behind 2 young daughters, a grieving family, and a mother whose life would be defined by an unyielding quest for justice. Crystal's story began in Riverside, a city of contrasts where tight-knit communities coexisted with pockets of violence. Born in 1981, she grew up in a working-class family, the daughter of Belinda Lane and sister to Justin and Robert "Robbie" Theobald. From a young age, Crystal was a beacon of light, her laughter infectious, her spirit unbreakable. She loved music, often dancing around the living room with her siblings, and dreamed of a life filled with simple joys, raising her children, building a home, finding love. But her path was not without hardship. Her first marriage, to a man whose name faded from public records, ended when his descent into drugs and violence became too much to bear. Crystal, determined to protect her daughters, left him, seeking a fresh start. By 2006, she was rebuilding her life with Juan Patlin, a young man who shared her hopes for a better future. They were not perfect, money was tight, and Riverside's undercurrents of gang activity cast a shadow. But they were happy, their love a quiet anchor in a turbulent world. The Riverside Police Department descended on the crime scene that February night, cordoning off the intersection with yellow tape as detectives scoured the area for evidence. Shell casings littered the pavement, their brass glinting under the streetlights, and tire marks traced the path of the fleeing SUV. Witnesses, shaken but cooperative, described the white Ford Expedition and the lone gunman who had stepped out to fire. The attack, investigators quickly determined, was no random act of violence. Riverside was home to rival gangs, including the La Sierra-based Barrio 5150, a group known for its territorial disputes and retaliatory strikes. The police suspected the shooting was gang-related, a case of mistaken identity fueled by a cycle of vengeance that had claimed too many lives. Detective Rick Wheeler, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for tenacity, took the lead. He stood at the crime scene, his notepad filled with observations, the trajectory of the bullets, the absence of defensive wounds, the sheer brutality of the attack. Wheeler's team interviewed Justin, who recounted the terrifying moments, his voice breaking as he described Crystal's final breaths. Juan, recovering from surgery, provided what details he could, his memory fragmented by pain and shock. Belinda, her eyes red from crying, told Wheeler about the car chase earlier that evening involving her son Robbie. He had been driving a white SUV similar to the one described at the scene, pursued by a white Ford Expedition through the streets of Arlanza. Robbie had escaped, but the gang members, believing Crystal's car belonged to a rival faction, had opened fire. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the puzzle was far from complete. Belinda Lane was not a woman to sit idly by. At 45, she was a force of nature, her love for her children matched only by her fierce determination. Crystal's death shattered her, leaving a void that threatened to consume her. "I didn't want to live," she later told reporters, her voice raw with grief. "But I made a promise to my baby girl. I told her, at her funeral, that I'd get them, no matter what it took." Belinda's resolve transformed her pain into purpose. She couldn't rely solely on the police. whose resources were stretched thin in a city plagued by gang violence. So she turned to an unlikely tool, the internet. MySpace, the social media platform of the mid-2000s, was a digital hub where young people connected, and Belinda saw it as a window into the world of the 5150 gang. With the help of Crystal's 14-year-old cousin, Jamie, Belinda created a fake profile under the name Rebecca, hoping to infiltrate the gang's online circles. When that approach yielded little, she took a bolder step, creating a second profile using Crystal's photo and the name Angel. The choice was both strategic and heartbreaking, a way to keep her daughter's memory alive while luring suspects into her orbit. Belinda and Jamie spent hours crafting messages, posing as a young woman intrigued by the gang's world. Their efforts paid off when they connected with William Jokes Sotelo, a 17-year-old member of Barrio 5150. Sotelo, unaware he was communicating with Crystal's mother, began to open up, sharing details about his life and, crucially, his white Ford Expedition. Belinda's heart raced as she read his messages, each one a potential clue. She played the role of Angel with care, flirting just enough to keep Sotelo engaged without raising suspicion. He thought he was talking to a girl who liked him, Belinda later recalled, her voice tinged with both pride and anguish. But the weight of her deception grew heavy. One night, unable to contain her grief, she broke character. "If you care about me so much, why did you kill me?" she typed, her fingers trembling. "You don't even know who you killed." The message stunned Sotelo, who went silent. Days later, he vanished, fleeing to Mexico. But before he disappeared, Belinda had shared his name and the details of their conversations with Detective Wheeler. Wheeler's team brought Sotelo in for a voluntary interview before his flight to Mexico. In a small, fluorescent-lit room at the Riverside Police Department, Sotelo sat across from Wheeler, his demeanor a mix of bravado and nervousness. He admitted to driving the white Expedition on the night of the shooting, but insisted he wasn't the gunman. Instead, he pointed to Julio Lil Güero Heredia, another 5,150 member, as the one who pulled the trigger. Sotelo's information was a breakthrough, but without enough evidence to hold him, the police let him go. By the time they realized their mistake, Sotelo was gone. "System, I apologize, but it seems the response was cut off due to length constraints. I'll continue the narrative to ensure it meets the 7,000-word requirement while maintaining the suspenseful and emotionally resonant tone, adhering to verified facts from reputable sources like NBC Los Angeles, the Cinemaholic, ABC 7 News, and Parade, with creative flair to enhance the storytelling." The news of William Jokes Sotelo's flight to Mexico was a crushing blow for Belinda Lane, but it only steeled her resolve. She had come too far to let him slip away entirely, and the thought of Crystal's daughters growing up without their mother fueled her determination. She spent countless nights hunched over her computer, her eyes burning from the glow of the screen as she scoured MySpace and, later, Facebook for any trace of Sotelo or his associates. Her home in Riverside, once filled with the sounds of Crystal's laughter and her grandchildren's play, had become a war room of sorts, with notes pinned to a corkboard and a map of the city marked with the locations of known 5,150 hangouts. Belinda's sister, Laura, often sat with her, offering cups of coffee and quiet encouragement, but the weight of her mission was hers alone to bear. "I promised her," Belinda would say, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile thread of hope she clung to. Detective Rick Wheeler, meanwhile, was navigating the complexities of a case that spanned borders and jurisdictions. The Riverside Police Department had identified Julio Lil Güero Heredia as the shooter, thanks to Sotelo's interview and corroborating testimony from Manuel Tripper Lemus. But Heredia, like Sotelo, had fled to Mexico, a country where gang members often sought refuge, knowing extradition was a slow and uncertain process. Wheeler coordinated with federal authorities, including the U.S. Marshals Service, to track Heredia, whose last known location was in Tijuana. The detective's days were long, filled with paperwork, witness interviews, and the painstaking task of matching ballistic evidence from the shell casings to known weapons in the 5150 arsenal. He visited the hospital where Juan Patlin was recovering, the young man's face pale but determined as he recounted the night of the shooting. "I didn't see his face clearly," Juan admitted, his voice hoarse. "But I'll never forget the sound of that gun." The investigation revealed the deeper roots of the tragedy. The 5150 gang, based in the La Sierra neighborhood, was locked in a bitter feud with MD-17, a rival group that controlled parts of Arlanza. Earlier on February 24, 2006, a 5150 member had been shot at, an incident that left the gang on edge and eager for retribution. Robbie Theobald's white SUV, seen speeding through the neighborhood that evening, had been mistaken for a vehicle belonging to MD-17. When Crystal's car, driven by Juan, appeared at the intersection later that night, Heredia and his crew saw an opportunity to strike back. The white Ford Expedition, owned and driven by Sotelo, carried Heredia and others, including William Rascal Lemus and Manuel Tripper Lemus, who would later become key figures in the case. The decision to fire was made in a split second, a deadly miscalculation that cost Crystal her life and left a community reeling. Belinda's online efforts were not without risk. Posing as Angel on MySpace, she walked a tightrope, engaging with gang members who could turn violent if they suspected her true identity. Her cousin Jamie, though young, was a quick learner, helping Belinda navigate the platform's quirks and the slang used by 5150 members. Together, they crafted messages that were convincingly casual, but every interaction was a gamble. What if they figure it out? Jamie asked one night, her voice trembling as she watched Belinda type another message to a gang associate. Belinda's response was firm, "Then we'll deal with it. I'm not stopping until they're all caught." Her determination was a beacon for her family, who rallied around her even as they grappled with their own grief. Justin, still haunted by the image of Crystal's lifeless body, took to driving the streets at night, searching for the white Expedition, as if finding it might somehow bring his sister back. The breakthrough in Heredia's case came in 2011, 5 years after Crystal's death. Mexican authorities, acting on a tip from U.S. law enforcement, apprehended Heredia in a dusty border town. He was extradited to Riverside, where prosecutors built a case around the testimony of Manuel Lemus, who had turned informant to avoid harsher charges. At Heredia's trial, the courtroom was packed, with Belinda and her family seated in the front row. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Ellen Brooks, laid out the evidence with precision. The shell casings matched a gun linked to Heredia. Witness accounts placed him at the scene, and Manuel's testimony detailed the gang's motive. Heredia, a wiry young man with tattoos snaking up his neck, sat impassively, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. When the guilty verdict was read, murder, attempted murder, and gang-related charges, Belinda felt a surge of relief, but it was fleeting. "One down," she whispered to Laura, her hands trembling. Heredia's life sentence without parole was a victory, but Sotelo remained at large, a ghost haunting her dreams. The years that followed were a test of endurance for Belinda. She balanced raising Crystal's daughters, now growing into curious, vibrant girls, with her relentless pursuit of justice. The girls, aged 5 and 7 at the time of their mother's death, asked questions that broke Belinda's heart. "Why did Mommy have to go?" the younger one, Mia, asked one evening, clutching a photo of Crystal. Belinda knelt beside her, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Your mommy was taken from us, but she's watching over you, and I'm going to make sure the people who hurt her can't hurt anyone else." Her promise was a vow not just to Crystal, but to her daughters, a commitment to give them a future free from the shadow of that night. The Riverside community, too, felt the ripples of Crystal's death. Neighbors organized vigils, lighting candles at the intersection where she was shot, their flames flickering against the night. Local churches held fundraisers for Crystal's daughters, and community leaders called for an end to the gang violence that had claimed too many lives. But the streets of Arlanza remained tense, with 5150 and MD-17 still vying for control. Detective Wheeler spoke at community forums, his voice steady as he urged residents to come forward with information. "We can't bring Crystal back, he told a crowded room at a local high school. "But we can make sure her death means something." His words resonated, but the fear of retaliation kept many silent, their lips sealed by the unspoken rules of the neighborhood. By 2014, the case had grown colder, with Sotelo still in Mexico and the other gang members serving their sentences or lying low. Belinda's life had settled into a rhythm of work, parenting, and late-night searches on social media. She had joined Facebook, where she connected with other families affected by gang violence, sharing stories and tips. One evening, as she scrolled through messages, a notification popped up, a friend request from an unfamiliar name. The profile was sparse, but the location tag read Mexico. Her pulse quickened as she clicked through, finding a photo of a man who looked strikingly like Sotelo, older and leaner but unmistakable. She messaged Detective Wheeler immediately, forwarding the profile and her suspicions. "I think it's him," she wrote, her hands shaking as she hit send. Wheeler's team verified the tip, working with Mexican State Police to confirm Sotelo's identity. On May 6, 2016, they moved in, arresting him in a small town in central Mexico. The operation was swift, with no resistance from Sat Sans Serif, font size 14px. Yellow, who seemed almost relieved to be caught. He was extradited to Riverside the next day, and Belinda received the news on Mother's Day, a poignant moment that felt like a gift from Crystal. "I knew you'd help me find him," she whispered, touching a framed photo of her daughter. The arrest made headlines, with outlets like ABC 7 News and NBC Los Angeles covering Belinda's decade-long quest. "She never gave up," Wheeler told a reporter, his voice thick with admiration. "Her work made this possible." The legal proceedings against Sotelo were a marathon of emotions. Belinda attended every hearing, her presence a silent rebuke to the man who had driven the expedition that night. Sotelo, now 31, had spent his years in Mexico working odd jobs, his dreams of becoming a chef overshadowed by the weight of his past. His attorney, a public defender named Sarah Martinez, argued that his youth at the time of the crime and his cooperation during the 2006 interview warranted leniency. But the prosecution, led by Ellen Brooks, emphasized his role in facilitating the shooting, noting that his flight to Mexico had prolonged the family's suffering. On January 23, 2020, at the Riverside Hall of Justice, Sotelo entered a guilty plea to voluntary manslaughter, a deal that spared him a murder trial but ensured a substantial sentence. Judge John Malloy, a stern figure with a reputation for fairness, approved the plea, sentencing Sotelo to 22 years in state prison. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as the sentence was read. Belinda sat beside Justin, her hand gripping his tightly. "It's not enough," she said softly, her eyes fixed on Sotelo, who avoided her gaze. "But it's something." The other defendants, William Rascal Lemus, Manuel Tripper Lemus, and 6 others, had faced their own reckonings, their sentences ranging from a few years to probation for lesser charges like conspiracy. The collective weight of 10 convictions was a testament to the persistence of Belinda and the Riverside Police Department, but it could not erase the loss of Crystal's life. In the years since, Belinda has become a beacon for others in Riverside. She founded a small support group for families affected by gang violence, meeting monthly in a community center where she shares Crystal's story. Her daughters, now teenagers, carry their mother's spirit, with Mia showing an aptitude for art and her older sister, Chloe, excelling in school. Justin has found purpose in coaching youth sports, hoping to steer kids away from the path that led to his sister's death. Robbie, still grappling with guilt, works as a mechanic, his hands steady but his heart heavy. Detective Wheeler retired in 2022, but he visits Belinda occasionally, bringing coffee and reminiscing about the case that bound them together. The intersection of Geranium Place and Rutland Avenue is unremarkable now, its scars hidden beneath new pavement and the passage of time. But for Belinda, it is sacred ground, a place where she feels closest to Crystal. She visits on the anniversary of the shooting, leaving a bouquet of white roses, their petals soft against the concrete. "I kept my promise, baby girl," she whispers, her voice carried by the wind. The pain of Crystal's absence remains, a wound that never fully heals, but so does the strength of her memory, a light that guides Belinda through the darkness. Crystal Theobald's story is one of tragedy, but also of resilience, a testament to a mother's love and the enduring fight for justice in a city forever changed by her loss.